Hello everyone, Chiori will be the one and only upcoming character of patch 4.5, and another Geo character at that. It seems like Hoyo finally remembered that Geo is in fact an element in this game. At first glance, she seems like a simple unit, and although this is true when considering her actual intended role as a Geo sub-DPS, the actual mechanics of her abilities can be quite convoluted and has intricacies that do change her strength. I will try my best to both explain these intricacies, but also make them as simple to understand as possible, so that you know what Chiori actually does from what we currently know, of course. Last thing, before we get started, any damage comparisons and estimates I will talk about are not my own, but cited from J Stern again. This guy is a legend, doing calcs as soon as we got an inkling of info and constantly updating them as the days pass on stream, so go check him out. And with that, let's get started on Chiori. Chiori is a 5-star Geo sword user. The base stats are shown right here. Ascends with crit rate, so that's nice to make her easier to build. Her normal attacks are just normal attacks that look nice, but you really won't be using them in their intended role, just in meme on-field stuff. One important thing to note is that they only scale on attack, while the rest of her kit scales on both attack and defense, as you'll shortly see. Next, we'll actually talk about her burst real quick. It does damage, and that's pretty much it. 60 energy cost, 15-second cooldown, and scales off both attack and defense, with defense having higher scaling. The scaling is pretty good, but compared to her skill, which you'll see soon, it is not the majority of her damage, so it's more of a use it if you can, it's fine to not use it ultimate. Now onto her skill, which is pretty much Chiori's entire kit and the majority of her damage profile. When you use her skill, she dashes and deals damage, and it works exactly like Kaching's and Alhytham's skill, where you can hold to aim its direction. At the end of the dash, Chiori spawns a doll that will periodically deal damage and last for 17 seconds. The doll hits 5 times, doesn't move, so it works very similarly to a Yai turret, having similar range to it as well. In addition, its attacks have a very small AoE similar to Hyper Boom procs. Both the dash damage and the doll turret damage again scales off attack and defense, with defense having higher scaling. Now, the special thing about this skill is that if there is a Geo construct on the field, an additional doll will spawn near the active character, meaning you can have 2 doll turrets shooting at the same time. This second doll can spawn in 2 different ways. If you Chiori E when there is a Geo construct on field already, 2 will spawn at the same time at the end of the dash, both of them near where your character is currently. If you Chiori E, then place a construct, the first will spawn by Chiori's side at the end of the dash, and the second one will spawn later whenever you place your construct on the field. If you spawn another construct after this, no doll spawns and the initial 2 aren't replaced. And it seems like even after the construct that spawned the doll is destroyed in the middle of the doll's duration, the doll will still be on the field, so that's good. You can only have a maximum of 2 dolls, so if you manage to scale again like with Sacrificial Sword, the old doll will despawn and a new one will spawn. The mechanic of doll spawning actually affects her energy generation, which I will show on the screen. With one doll, it's simple to understand. Each hit has an 80% chance to generate 1 particle and 20% chance to generate 2. Since you can easily get unlucky, I think it's safe to assume that you get 5 particles per skill. And this is pretty good when you consider that other Geo supports rely on construct damage to generate particles. I'm looking at you, Zhongli and Albedo, which is extremely inconsistent. With Chiori, the dolls aren't constructs, so you'll always get a decent amount of energy per skill. With 2 dolls, you can technically get more energy if you stagger the spawning of the dolls. This is because although the particle energy generation ICD is 1.9 seconds, the dolls hit every 3.6 seconds. This means that with 2 dolls, you can have 1 doll attack, then like 2 seconds later, spawn a doll and it attacks, and both doll attacks will generate energy. If they spawn at the same time and thus attack at the same time, however, the particle generation will act the same as if you spawned only 1 doll. The thing is that I've seen example rotations, and it seems like in every team with 2 dolls, you can only stagger doll spawning on the first rotation, so I think it's still better to assume that Chiori's skill will generate 5 or 6 particles whether or not you have 1 or 2 dolls spawning. One last thing on her dolls is that they do not snapshot buffs except defense buffs according to our current knowledge. Now, some people say this is bad for her. In my opinion, I think snapshotting can be both good and bad. And it doesn't really matter to me whether or not she does or doesn't snapshot. If she snapshotted everything, yes, she can stack buffs like Bennett and Goro before using Chiori, and she'll do more damage, but that comes at the cost of less buff uptime on your on-field carry like Itto, so it may or may not be a DPS gain. So, in my opinion, doesn't really matter too much. So that's everything on her skill, but not really because her A1 talent also adds some more stuff to her skill. So let's go back to the first visual. At the end of your dash and the dolls are spawned, you have a choice of following up with either a normal attack or a skill. If you skill into a normal attack, Chiori gains 5 seconds of Geo Infusion, which can be overridden. This will be used for mostly on-field meme stuff. The majority of the time you will skill into skill. When you do this, Chiori instantly swaps to the next character in your party. Within 8 seconds, if your on-field character hits with a normal charged or plunging attack, there will be a coordinated attack equal to the E dash damage, and this is considered skill damage. You can proc one coordinated attack every 2 seconds with a maximum of 2 coordinated attacks per skill into skill. This swap to the next character in your party is actually noticeably faster and smoother than when you normally switch characters, and because of this, you need to keep in mind the party order when you play Chiori so your rotation will be correct. For instance, if Chiori was in the first slot in this party, performing a skill into skill will swap into Dea. For her other talents, the A4 talent gives Chiori 20% geo damage bonus for 20 seconds when a construct is spawned, so another incentive to have construct creating character on your team. And lastly, her special passive gives 10% movement speed if your character has a skin or has a glider that isn't the base one. A funny yet thematic passive for the outfit designer. Now before moving on, I wanted to address her attack and defense scaling. This is not an example of bad split scaling that people talk about, but an example of good dual scaling. For a character with split scaling, one part of their kit scales with one stat, but another part scales with a different stat. So when you build for one stat over the other, you sacrifice the other part of her kit. The most recent example of this is Chevris. Her healing and attack buffs scale on HP, but her actual damage values scale on attack, so you realistically have to choose one aspect of her kit over the other. In contrast, Chiori has good dual scaling because whether or not you build attack or defense, you will gain damage from her kit from her skill and burst. Sure, defense scaling is technically better, but if you gain attack like in your substats, you will still gain damage and it isn't a useless stat, making artifact farming just a little bit easier to manage. Similar examples include Nahida and Alhaitham, whose damage scales on both attack and elemental mastery. So with that, let's go over her constellations. First, C1, the currently most controversial one for a valid reason. To my knowledge, it increases the doll's range by 50% and not its AoE. However, the big thing is that it removes the geo contract limitation of her kit. With C1, she will spawn 2 dolls and activate her A4 talent immediately after skilling if you have another Geo character on her team. This is clearly made for Geo DPSs without a construct in their kit like Navia and Noelle, so you aren't forced to run another Geo unit with a construct to actually get full value out of Chiori's kit. For those characters, the DPS gain is pretty big and relieves team building stress. This type of design rightfully left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. But what's more weird to me is that for Geo DPS characters with constructs like Itto, this constellation pretty much does nothing since the range increase to me is like whatever. So it's weird that some characters gain a lot from C1 while others gain little to nothing. And like I mentioned before about energy generation and staggering doll spawning, with C1 you will always spawn 2 dolls at the same time, so you will always pretty much get 5 or 6 energy particles per skill. C2 makes it so that after either skill follow-up, a simple doll will spawn near the enemy when your on-fielder hits with a normal charged or plunge attack. Simple dolls deal 170% damage of a normal doll hit and deal damage once before despawning. One can be spawned every second with a maximum of 3 simple dolls that can spawn per skill follow-up. TLDR, just more skill damage. C3 gives 3 skill levels. C4 pretty much spawns a maximum of 3 simple dolls after using Chiori's ult. However, the wording makes it seem that Chiori must be on field for the dolls to spawn, so it's more of a good constellation that you can take advantage when you get C6, as you'll see. C5 gives 3 burst levels, and for C6, after Chiori gains the Geo Infusion from her skill into normal attack, her skill CD is reduced by 14.5 seconds, pretty much resetting its cooldown, and she pretty much gains Yalan C6, so more damage. Next, let's talk about builds. As an off-field Geo sub DPS, her artifact sets are pretty straightforward: Golden Troop or Husk. Golden Troop is technically a little bit better because elemental skill damage bonus just outright buffs her mainly skill damage, while defense from Husk only affects the defense scaling and not the attack scaling portion of her kit. However, the difference is relatively small, so just pick which set you have better stats on. On-field Chiori believers should focus on sets focusing on attack since her normals only scale off of attack. Stats wise, pretty simple: Defense Hourglass, Geo Goblet, Crit Circlet. Substat priority, you should focus on crit, defense, attack, and ER last. Since she scales off both defense and attack, Crit has more value since it just buffs both portions of her scaling. The reason energy recharge is so low and technically a substat you can just ignore is that the majority of Chiori's damage comes from her skill. Sure, her burst does good damage, but it isn't worth investing energy recharge stats to burst every rotation when you can just build more offensive stats to boost your skill damage, and just burst whenever it's up. This is the exact same logic I have with Yai's skill and burst, and Chiori's kit is pretty much Yai's kit. For on-field winters, just swap defense and attack. Weapons-wise, in terms of off-field DPS, her signature will be her best in slot. Gives her a lot of crit damage, extra defense, and helps with both on-field and off-field Chiori players with buffs that increase when your party deals Geo damage. Solid weapon. As for other 5 stars, the one I will highlight is Jade Cutter. Just a solid stat stick with lots of crit rate. For 4 stars, the Battle Pass weapon is really good on her. Solid crit stats on top of skill and burst damage bonus, and it may be her best 4 star. Other 4 stars include Festering Desire and Cinnabar Spindle. Again, boosting skill damage is good. ER is technically not as important on her, so a little bit of a waste there. And with Spindle, technically she cannot take full advantage of the passive when you have 2 dolls on the field. In addition, defense is good and all, but it doesn't boost the attack scaling portion of her kit. Still, they are solid, but a lot of people don't have these weapons, so her best quote free-to-play weapon, even though it's technically not free-to-play, but you should have it easily, is actually the 3-star weapon Harbinger of Dawn. Gives crit, which is really good on Chiori. And you do need to be higher than 90% HP, but it should be easier since she's mainly an off-field DPS. And it seems to perform better than Festering and Spindle, so it's good that an available 3-star weapon is good on her. Honorable mention is Sacrificial Sword for on-field Chiori players only. With this, you can have 10 seconds of Geo infusion. Now let's take a step back and consider the big picture about Chiori, analyzing her role in the overall meta. As a Geo character, we should first review the state of Geo in general. I think it's almost universally agreed upon that Geo is the worst element in the game. At its core, Geo's main identity are Geo constructs and having an element with a relatively unimpactful reaction with other elements. Because of this, and the fact that most Geo characters are kind of designed to synergize with other Geo characters, Mono Geo teams serve the basis of Geo's identity. This design isn't inherently bad. Not every element has to mix with the others. However, the biggest problem is that there aren't that many good Geo units for us to choose from. We only have 9 total Geo units at the moment, 10 including Chiori. The only other element with a similar number is Dendro, which also has 9. But number 1, they aren't designed with Mono Dendro in mind, so you can use other elements just fine. And Dendro was released way later. Consequently, if you want to play a Geo team, you have very limited options. On top of that, several Geo units only really work in Geo teams. This makes those teams more inaccessible, as pulling those characters may only allow you to play one team. To make it even worse, the Geo constructs have their own gameplay issues, making them feel pretty bad to play. There's a reason why Navia as a Geo unit released recently is pretty strong. You are incentivized to run other elements in her teams, and she doesn't rely on Geo constructs. She is pretty much a Geo unit that's not really a Geo unit. Now, because Chiori is a new Geo unit being released, that fact itself is already helpful for Geo. They just need more characters for more options. The other reason why Chiori really helps Geo is just her inherent strength compared to what we have. So let's see what the optimal Geo team is at the moment. We have a main DPS like Itto, Goro, Albedo, and Zhongli. The main DPS is a lock on the team, and although it would be nice to have another unit that can buff Geo like Goro, especially at C6, if you have him, he's pretty strong for Geo defense scalers, so he's a lock as well. The other 2 slots, Albedo and Zhongli, are 100% replaceable. In fact, a lot of times people replace Albedo with Yelan or Zhongli with Bennett just because Yelan and Bennett are just stronger units in terms of damage. So clearly, Albedo and Zhongli are the weakest points of the team. So where does Chiori make the upgrade? Well, with her current design, she realistically just replaces Albedo. It is clear that Hoyo is intending for Chiori to just be an Albedo upgrade. Both are off-field sub-DPSs that only deal damage, so the amount of damage they deal is the only factor determining their strength. And with the current calcs I've seen, Chiori at minimum does about 1.5 times Albedo's damage, up to double in her best conditions. She does a respectable amount of damage even at 1 doll, and she doesn't have to deal with making sure a construct stays on the field to deal damage. This is just power creep, but I think that with the current state of Geo, the plug needs to be pulled someday on the weakest points of Geo. So to me, this is just a necessary evil in order to bring more relevancy to Geo teams. Lastly, let's consider Chiori's teams. Simply put, you want to slot her into teams that originally wanted Albedo. Now, there can be cases where she doesn't replace Albedo, but they work together as a duo, in a similar fashion to Yelan and Xingqiu. The biggest difference, however, is that Yelan and Xingqiu are individually strong units, and you are happy to have both of them on a team. With Chiori and Albedo, having Albedo on the team is actually quite the cost compared to other options you can use. Despite this, using this duo instead of replacing Albedo does work and can technically be slotted anywhere like non-Geo teams. Albedo's construct synergizes well with Chiori's skill, and they generate particles for each other. It's alright, but nowhere near optimal, especially for non-Geo teams, so for the rest of Chiori's teams, I will focus on where she will shine in Geo teams. Itto is the biggest winner here. A current example team is Itto, Goro, Albedo, and Zhongli. Chiori can actually replace either Albedo or Zhongli here for an upgrade. However, it will most likely be Albedo because Zhongli's shield gives resistance to interruption, resistance shred, and the shield activates Geo resonance, so it's better with higher character investment. However, the best thing about Itto is because he has Ushi as a construct, he already fulfills Chiori's requirement for 2 dolls, so you don't even need Zhongli. You can replace him with a character like Yelan with good personal damage and a damage percent buff for Itto, which is pretty valuable for him. She was already being slotted into Itto teams, and this looks like to be his new best team in terms of damage. So if you're an Itto main, Chiori is looking like a great upgrade. Now onto Navia, and there's been a lot of discussion about this topic. The current Navia team is the Bennett Shenling version with Zhongli. You could run Farina as a last slot, but I personally don't like playing that team because of healing issues, and I think it's more accurate to consider Chiori replacing another Geo unit. The biggest downside to Navia is that because she doesn't have a construct in her kit, if you just replace Zhongli on the team, you can't take full advantage of Chiori's dolls because she only spawns 1. Therefore, she does less damage. In order to fully take advantage of Chiori's kit, you need to slot in a 3rd Geo unit on the team, which isn't really good because Navia wants to have other elements on the team, or you just pull C1 and ignore that restriction. Now, according to the calcs I've seen, even at C0 with 1 doll, Chiori is still an upgrade in Navia teams over Zhongli. With Chiori, Navia's team DPS is around 62,000, while with Zhongli, the team DPS is about 59 to 60,000. So technically, Chiori is perfectly fine as a Navia support. Now, is this worth the pull if you just play Navia and you just pull Chiori at C0? Well, that's up to you. Personally, I don't think so. And it does feel bad that just getting C1 will widen this team DPS comparison. However, C0 Chiori is still a fine support with Navia. It just won't be a huge difference unless you pull C1 at this current moment. In terms of the other Geo units and their synergies with Navia, Yunjin doesn't have much synergy as she's mostly a normal attack buffer that just happens to be Geo. Goro, who I mentioned with Itto teams, works well with Chiori because she benefits from his buff, and according to our current knowledge, she does snapshot the defense buff that Goro gives. However, I wouldn't just use Goro and Chiori as a pair by itself. I would definitely want another Geo DPS that benefits from Goro's buffs to maximize his value. Zhongli is in general good for his shield and res shred on top of activating Geo resonance, and his pillar activates Chiori's 2nd doll. So yeah, he's solid with Chiori as another support. Noelle, I think, liked Albedo with Goro in her team along Farina. She does have the same Geo construct problem as Navia, but like I said before, even 1 doll Chiori is still an upgrade over Albedo, so she will strengthen Noelle teams. Ningguang, I think, also had Albedo in her team slot, so again, Chiori replacing him is good here. And her Jade screen is a construct, so that's good for Chiori. And lastly, Geo MC has a construct too, so you could always fall back on MC for another Chiori doll if you need it. And with that, that's everything I wanted to cover about Chiori. She's a solid off-field Geo sub DPS that, while she only deals damage and nothing else, she does that job well even at 1 doll. In terms of the Geo meta, she is one of the strongest characters you can get, ultimately being a strict upgrade to Albedo's role as an off-field Geo sub DPS in terms of damage and reliability. Chiori is pretty much Albedo 2.0 and a character that Geo teams have desperately needed. If you are a Geo main, Chiori will be a good pull for you as she will elevate Geo teams DPS such as Itto and even Navia at a smaller extent at C0. However, Chiori's strength is ultimately her main weakness as a character. Sure, she is Albedo 2.0 and does 1.5 to 2 times more damage than him, but Albedo wasn't a strong unit to begin with and could be argued one of the worst limited 5-star characters. So is being 1.5 to 2 times Albedo even enough? She upgrades pretty much all Geo teams DPS, but is the increase enough considering the myriad amount of other strong teams we have? On top of that, she serves the same role as Albedo, but the teams he was in were quite limited. Will this lack of versatility plummet her pull value? I think the true answers to these questions are ultimately up to you in the context of your own account. Personally, I think that while she is a relatively strong character on her own, especially when considering the Geo context, with the state Geo is in right now, I wouldn't mind just full sending it. I'm completely open buffing her numbers or just giving her a team damage buff in her kit. That A4 talent that gives Geo damage to Chiori when your party spawns a construct, just give that to the whole team. Sure, it's power creeping Albedo more, but at this point we've crossed that line already. And Geo still has a lot of room to get more buffs for their teams. Because she is Geo, having higher multipliers is fine considering they can't take advantage of reactions, and it can open up her more to non-Geo teams as a more acceptable flex slot. Her current optimal teams are just mono Geo teams, which in my opinion makes her pretty niche. If you thought Shen Yun was niche, Chiori is like 10 times more niche than her, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Geo needs help, and her release is a step in the right direction in bringing Geo back to the spotlight, just like Navia's release. Geo just needs more options and more upgrades, and Chiori is definitely one of Geo's upcoming saviors. Hopefully I explained everything well. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try my best to respond. Leave the video a like and subscribe if you like analysis on upcoming characters like this. And yeah, I hope all of you have a wonderful day.